Cut down day edition of Birds 365. Johnny Mac, Jody Mac. And we're joined by another M. He spells his first name with a G. We forgive him that. Yeah. He's not JM. He's only GM. But he's a bud, and he does a great job covering the Eagles for Inside the Birds. Our buddy, Geoff Mosher. How are you, Mr. Mosher?
I'm good, and I may have to go enlist my friend Jeff Schwartz, former offensive lineman, to go pay a visit over your way if you're going to make fun of GEOFF. He's a lot bigger than me.
Send the big guy at me, huh? Okay.
Yeah, he's my henchman.
Jeff, obviously, Inside the Birds, the podcast everybody knows with Adam Kaplan, InsideTheBirds.com, the website. And I want to give a quick plug because you guys are the big stars. Everybody knows Mosher and Kaplan, but Andrew DeCecco's also helping them out. He does a great job at InsideTheBirds.com. So I wanted to give Andrew a little shout out. But obviously, it's cut down day, Jeff. We've already started. I think the biggest machinations happened yesterday, had nothing to do with the cuts. That's Rodney McLeod, Landon Dickerson being activated off the PUP for Rodney, off the NFI list for Landon. Any of that surprised you? Rodney stated week one was his goal, but Landon, there was a little wiggle room there.
Yeah, it surprised me a little bit only because Rodney, I know that his goal was week one, but at his age and with that being the second time he's coming off the knee surgery, I wasn't sure, and I'm still not, right? It doesn't mean he's going to be ready week one. It's just a step in the right direction. But I thought one, if not both, might start the year on one of the lists that puts you out a couple of weeks before you can, come back and practice a little bit. So I thought it's a good sign. Obviously, the team believes that both Rodney and Landon can probably play sooner than later, and we're willing to put them on the list now. I mean, on the 53-man now.
Jeff, any beat guy worth his salt, and certainly you are, and John is, have come up with a projected 53-man roster. I just asked J Mac about it in our first segment about how many corners they're going to keep, because Michael Jacquet, nobody's surprised that he was given his walking papers. John was a little surprised that they let James go. How many corners do you think are going to make this 53-man roster, at least when they cut down at 4 o'clock today before the juggling begins?
Yeah, and see, so that, Adam and I talked about this on the last podcast. It used to be kind of cool to do your 53-man roster projection and see how many you can get right.
It's hard now.
Now, 24 hours later, it's irrelevant because of the waiver claims and the trades that are made. It's almost like we should start redoing our final 53 or the 53 right before the season opener, because it's going to change. I mean, if Craig James is waived and Michael Jacquet is no longer with the team, I guess that leaves kind of like someone like Josiah Scott as the last man standing for the number 5 cornerback job. But I'm not 100% convinced that Josiah Scott is going to be the 5th cornerback for this team when the season begins. So he might be tomorrow or today at 4 o'clock. Let's see what happens tomorrow, because that's a position where you are able to look at the waiver wire, address it. It's really a special teams position, and you hope that the person that you claim can also contribute. If that person has to contribute, they've got some versatility inside, outside. I don't know that they see Josiah Scott as really an inside and outside guy. Good special teamer, good interior defender, but I have a feeling that that's a very adjustable bottom roster spot in the following days after the initial 53.
Yeah, and Jeff, you mentioned special teams. That's one of the reasons I thought Craig James would stick around, because he's their best special teams player, really, if you take away Rudy Ford, who they lost in the offseason. So now you start to think about, okay, where's Michael Clay when it comes to those core special teams guys, which isn't the sexiest thing in the world, but nonetheless, you're right. I mean, the waiver wire, it's become so much more difficult because of all the machinations, of all the new COVID rules. You have short-term injured reserve, you have the expanded practice squads, you have the ability to elevate people week to week from the practice squad to the regular roster. So it's become much more difficult. But do we make it more complicated, or do you think Howie Roseman goes the simple route? We always talk about vested veterans, for instance, Richard Rodgers, Jordan Howard, players like that. Cut them, their salary's not guaranteed, bring them back week 2. Or you just keep the best players.
There's a little bit of both. Obviously, you may have to go heavy or light at a certain position. Take tight end, for example. Right now, as we speak, Zach Ertz is on the roster. Dallas Goedert's on the roster. They like the kid Jack Stoll, who I think is going to make it. Of course, Tyree Jackson was a developmental player, right, John, that they really liked. And they're probably, I assume, as we sit here today, they're going to keep him and then put him on IR 24 hours later. But to do that, they may feel like they have to release Richard Rodgers because he's a vested veteran. And then once they make that transaction and put Tyree Jackson on IR, then they try to bring back Richard Rodgers after week 1 when you don't have to guarantee a salary. But John, that and Jody, this could also be a classic case of overthinking. I mean, Tyree Jackson was a quarterback. He looked nice this year, but he's really just transitioning to tight end, and he's hurt. So I've made the argument, go ahead and release him. Who is going to claim him off waivers and put him on their 53-man roster when A, he has 0 NFL experience at the position, and B, he's weeks away from being healthy, and C, he's probably not going to be active for you all throughout the year. So those are 3 really solid, legitimate reasons why they shouldn't keep Tyree Jackson. But all you have to do, John, to your point about overthinking, is go back to last year. They thought that they could do that with Noah Togiai, just cut him and then bring him back on the practice squad. And lo and behold, and I still am mind boggled by this, the Colts claimed him, despite the fact that there were no preseason games, no tape, theoretically, for anybody to be able to see what Noah Togiai was doing in practice. All people had was really just reporters saying, hey, this guy is a pretty good tight end. He can block a little bit. I mean, but every team in every camp has that, right? Somebody who's doing well and reporters tweeting about it. So maybe there was a little inside job there with Frank Reich and someone in the NovaCare complex. But the bottom line is the Eagles lost a player that, they wanted. Now, is in the grand scheme of things, it's not the biggest deal in the world, a tight end, but they lost a player that they wanted because they released him and couldn't bring him back. So I do understand sometimes why there's a little bit of overthinking when it comes to that roster tango.
Oh, so that explains why Nick Sirianni is the coach. Yeah. Frank Wright owed the Eagles one, so he said, well, hey, I got your next coach right here. I don't want to lose him off my staff, but if you want him, I'll give you the major time. Okay, that explains a lot. Thank you very much for that.
No, I thought it was always that Carson just wanted to play with Noah Togiai.
Oh, that's more.
And then they wound up releasing him, Noah, a couple of weeks ago, so it all didn't matter.
All right, I asked you about corner earlier, Moshe. I want to get your take on safety because those 2 positions go hand in hand. The Eagles have already let a couple of corners go, so we know what it's down to, and it's just one spot more or less, and who's going to get it or not. They still got a lot of safeties still on this roster, and with putting McLeod back on the active yesterday, it grew the number of safeties rather than reducing it. If you think they're going to keep 5 cornerbacks, how many safeties are they keeping?
Well, that's a good question, and I think the versatility of certain guys, Jody and John, may influence how they view the numbers. Elijah Riley is a guy who has played safety for the Eagles and is a good special teams player and has a chance to be a really nice developing special teams player in this league. He also played cornerback in college at Army. So with the defense, they're going to play a lot of teams that play 2 deep coverages, which the Eagles, they're not going to play it exclusively, but they're going to play it a lot more. Sometimes they look at those corners in a 2 deep zone or a 2 deep defense, and safeties is similar kind of positions because you always have that protection. Malcolm Jenkins was a corner in that kind of a defense in New Orleans before he came to Philadelphia. So I have a feeling Riley, the fact that he has cornerback in his background, that might help him. And maybe they consider him that 5th corner special teams guy, and that enables them to keep the 4 safeties that would come to mind, which would be obviously Rodney, Anthony Harris, Marcus Epps, and Kevon Wallace. Though you could also keep Andrew Adams, the 5th guy, because he's a special teamer, and B, you still might need that depth because just because Rodney is back doesn't mean he's going to be ready for week 1. And Kevon Wallace has been beat up for the last few weeks of camp. So, in fact, if they had to play a game today, I'm not quite sure who your starting safeties would be other than Anthony Harris.
Geoff, there's 2, when you talk about the fan base, there's probably 2 big lightning rod players, and it's going to be Andre Dillard and J.J. Arcega-Whiteside for obvious reasons. One's a former first-round pick, one's a former second-round pick. We all know GMs in this league, and I always point out it's not just Howie Roseman. People don't like Howie Roseman. Every GM in this league wants their premium picks to succeed. Has the rope run out for either of these two players?
Well, let's start with the wide receiver, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. Going into camp, I would have told you that the rope, if it hadn't run out, it was very close to running out. And it's not like he's had a wonderful training camp. But this is not a position where the Eagles are really deep, especially after their first 2 or 3. Actually, you can just argue, if we all assume Devontae Smith's going to be pretty good, after that, there's a lot of questions, So it's not a position of great depth for the team. And so you have a situation where J.J. Arcega-Whiteside is battling here to make it as one of the last wide receivers. And, a month ago, I would have told you the guy stands no chance. As we sit here today, I'm thinking he's got a pretty good chance. And John, I think the second round pick of it isn't as relevant as it was maybe last year. I think that they would have no problem cutting ties with him if they had better 4th and 5th talent at that position. But he's literally in a race right now because Travis Fulgham has done nothing to help his case over the course of the training camp. And John Hightower did not come into camp with great, reputation among the coaches. Then he got hurt, but he does add some value. So you kind of have these 3 guys who are jockeying for either 1 or 2 final spots. And I'm sure that special teams is going to play a role because that should for the last few special teams. The last few wide receiver spots, and they all bring a different kind of dimension to special teams. So that's going to be a really interesting decision to see what happens on cutdown day. As for Dillard, I agree with you. I think that the fact that he's a former first round pick, even though he's a backup right now, means a lot to Howie. I would think that, teams will call. I know teams will call. And I imagine the price tag will be pretty high to get him because this team needs depth on the offensive line, and he is a former first rounder.
Speaking of the wide receivers, just one man's opinion. Like you said, they've got after Devonta Smith. You could make an argument for anybody. We know Rager's staying because he's only 1 year in from being a second round pick. Watkins has played. Excuse me, did I say second first? Thank you. Watkins has played well enough that he comes out of the conversation too, but he's a year removed from not being able to get on the field during games. So there aren't a ton of givens in the wide receiver room. I go so far as to say, take the 3 starters, Watkins, Rager, and Devonta Smith, and put them aside. Every other Eagle wide receiver, if they cut him, who would get picked up? Is there anyone in that group that you'd say, oh, we're going to go in? Eagles are a little over on wide receivers. We're going to steal a wide receiver from them. I don't think there's one guy that would get claimed if they put him out there. I think they could bring any of them back for the practice squad or re-switching after the first 53. If you take a couple guys, put them on IR. I think they could play that game with anyone other than the starters at the wide receiver position.
You might be right. I mean, Greg Ward is Mr. Reliable. He's steady Eddie, but, everybody's got a Greg Ward on their team. Look, Travis Fulgham's probably the only one that might get claimed, and that's because for 4 weeks last year, he looked like he was Calvin Johnson. And so I'm sure there's always one coach or one GM out there that says, we can be the ones to tap into that guy. We can be the ones that brings him back to where he was last year when he was looking like one of the best young wide receivers in this league. And we would take a chance to put him on our 53. But other than that, you're right. I mean, that's no guarantee. And I could see Greg Ward and J.J. Arcega-Whiteside and others going through, and Hightower going through the waivers unclaimed. Yeah.
Geoff, I'm sure you saw a couple of days ago, Albert Breer from Sports Illustrated put out there his column, and he said the Eagles were taking calls on offensive linemen, which makes sense because they're very deep on the offensive line. They got some playing time, valuable playing time for guys like Nate Herbig and Jack Driscoll, Matt Pryor. Even Eagles fans don't think very much of Matt Pryor, but this is an offensive line deficient league as a whole. So that part of it made sense. Didn't make sense. The Eagles want to shop some of their depth, and I put that in quotations, at linebacker. Are they much deeper at linebacker than we thought coming into this process?
I don't know if it's about depth, John, and more so what are they doing in that position? For example, like the Sam linebacker spot that they've kind of toyed with all year long or all camp long. The two guys who have really been in the role for that, the running for it, are Jannard Avery, right? And then the rookie Patrick Johnson. And Jannard Avery not only has been hurt with the groin lately, but it's not really a position that he's played a whole lot. He's not a cover guy. He's not a rush and cover guy. He's simply been a rush guy who just is undersized and looks like he should be a 3-4 linebacker, which he probably should be in a rush situation. And of course, Patrick Johnson's a rookie. So if you're going to have a position, we have a Sam position, you need a starter, you need a backup. So you're telling me Jannard Avery is going to be the starter, and a rookie who's never played an NFL snap then would be the guy to come in if Jannard Avery is hurt. It just feels like to me, Gannon may look at this and say, year one, I can't do everything I want to do with the personnel I have, or the personnel I have right now, I need to get better personnel, and we can work with it because it's a situational position. So somewhere along the line, I'll get the guys I need. And that might make Howie say, well, here, we have Jannard Avery. He's not going to be in our top 4 in our pass rush. But I know Adam Kaplan on our podcast, Inside the Birds, did report that some teams had called about Jannard Avery. So I could see them kind of saying, this Sam thing is a nice idea, but we don't have exactly what we want for it right now. But we are taking call. Somebody's calling us about Jannard Avery, so maybe we can get some value there. But overall, to your point about depth, I don't see any other way you would say they have very good depth at linebacker that they would start pawning off any other players.
One of the linebacker questions is he really going to even play linebacker? And that's Ryan Kerrigan. We've all supposed that he could be in that Sam mix, but he's never done it before, not in a game. He's been a defensive end his entire life. And the Eagles are toying with using him at the linebacker position, or at least that's what's being reported. And then, of course, he breaks the thumb and he doesn't get out there on the field for weeks. What's going to happen with Kerrigan? Is there a chance they IR him for the first couple of weeks? Do they really want to test him out at a new position on the fly with games that actually count?
Jody, I don't think he's a linebacker in the sense of when we put the roster together, do we consider him linebacker or do we consider him defensive end? I just think it's the way that they use him. He is not going to be dropping back into coverage, but he has played a stand-up outside linebacker rush position, just like I was talking about with Avery before. Quite often in his career, earlier in his career with Washington, him and Brian Orakpo were your off outside linebackers in a 3-4. Was it Jim Haslett's defense, John? I don't even remember anymore who ran the defense at that point, but I know that
at that point,
those were the
I think
two,
it was Haslett.
Yeah, those were the two outside linebackers, but he was a rush outside linebacker, and that's the way they would use him here. Just because it's a 4-3 here still, so you're used to seeing.
Hold on, let me interrupt you, Jeff, because and I'll let you finish your point, but please, let me make. Didn't Jonathan Gannon continue to tell us about deception being so important, part of what he was going to do? So he's got Mosher believing he's never going to drop into coverage. When we put him out there, he's only going forward. He's only going to the quarterback. Oh, here comes Jonathan Gannon with this deception. He's actually going to have Brian Kerrigan try and cover somebody.
Yeah, well, is that a possibility? I triple dog dare him to do that.
Well, and by the way, there are great defensive ends in this league. Some of the greatest bats, Chandler Jones, you'll see, even J.J. Watt. They've dropped into coverage at times, like once in a blue moon to try to fool the quarterback.
Sure.
And if you're going to hold Geoff to that standard, I think what he's trying to say is, he's not dropping into coverage a lot. That's the point. But every once in a while, you might try to fool the quarterback. And speaking of quarterbacks, Geoff, I can't believe I've gotten this far into this. We haven't talked about a guy who arrived, Gardner Minshew. I want to get your thoughts on the trade in general, because I think it's so interesting. I mean, Gardner comes from Jacksonville, where he thinks he should be competing with Trevor Lawrence. I don't know. I haven't met the guy yet. As Jody is, they didn't give him to us yesterday, which shocked me. They claim they're giving him to us later this week. He wanted to compete with Trevor Lawrence. If you look at just his history, he's more accomplished than the starting quarterback in this team. How do you bring him in as a third string quarterback with that personality after what happened last year with the Eagles quarterback room?
Well, I think the big question after what happened last year, John, was would the Eagles sort of learn their lesson, or would they be the franchise that continues to beat the drum about always looking for young developmental quarterbacks? So I definitely understand the sensitivity involved there, but I feel like if you're a fan and you criticize Carson Wentz for not being Philly tough and not being able to handle the Jalen Hurts drafting, well, then you can't sit there and say Jalen Hurts should, has every right to be offended by the Gardner Minshew, addition. If you either believe that a quarterback should be mentally tough and built to withstand it, or that it's just not good processed by a team, right? So we'll see what happens. To me, I get what you're saying. Like, Jalen's done a really good job of just kind of funneling out all of the outside stuff, but it does go back to the fact that you're not really guaranteed anything as a quarterback in this league unless you're kind of picked in the first round or the top 10. Those guys get special treatment. We know it. But after that, the rules are off. And so Jalen Hurts has to prove himself. And until he does, and even when he does, as we saw with Carson Wentz, let's say he's great and gets a really long-term deal. Well, the Eagles are always going to be looking for the best available backup and cost-efficient backup like Gardner Minshew. And if that backup just happens to be pretty good, pretty flashy, pretty whatever, the Eagles have told you they're still going to go after it anyway. So I guess this is a small indication, John and Jody, that maybe they don't see what happened with Jalen and Carson as a repetitive issue, or as we always say, the unintended consequences, right? Which, you can question about fairly. And I've questioned their whole process on backup quarterbacks in the second round quite a bit. But they are clearly steadfast in this. And, that's either going to wind up paying off for them down the road, or it's going to be a continuously bad process that blows up in their faces down the road that will force them maybe to rethink their strategy.
I agree with almost everything you said. I will just add to the conversation, comparing what happened last year with Carson and now a situation that Jalen could be in. Major difference. Carson got $100 million. Jalen Hurts is still on his second round draft pick first contract. So that does change the dynamic.
It's not apples to apples. I agree with you with that wholeheartedly.
Right. But your point about got to be Philly tough. That's right. Doesn't matter what your contract says. You're supposed to be Philly tough. You're the starter. Here's the job. Don't let anybody take it away from you. Carson Wentz did. Jalen Hurts, don't let that happen. Go out and play like a star, and then everything will be fine. All right, back to the Eagles and the coaching staff. Nick Sirianni, we got a chance to see him call plays for 3 games with minimal starters in there, with guys in and out of the lineup, with not really worrying about winning or whatever. What have you learned through either the joint practices and or the 3 preseason games about Nick Sirianni, the play caller?
That's interesting. I thought in the first game after Hurts came out after the first 2 series and Joe Flacco went in, I thought the offense was notably quick, meaning and that part of that was probably Joe behind the second string offensive line, and they weren't sure how to feel about it at the time, but definitely getting the ball out of the hands quickly, over the middle, throwing to running backs. Now, that's something that they've done a lot in the preseason, and it's something Nick Sirianni hasn't really been secretive about going forward, which almost makes me suspicious. I mean, he's really come out and talked a lot about how the plan is to throw the ball to the running backs, but you might want to be skeptical of that. But then you look at what they've got at running back with Miles Sanders, with Kenny Gainwell, and with Boston Scott. All 3 of them can catch the ball, and Kenny Gainwell is going to get on the field pretty early as long as he can continue to handle the workload that they've given him. So I believe him. I do think, you look at the wide receiver situation. We already talked about that. Tight end situation is good as far as talent at it, but I think I can see the ability for them to kind of implement some of that college-y stuff where you're throwing to the running backs, where you have the old pony package, but back in the day that used to be a power run thing. Now it's you got 2 running backs at the same time in the backfield, where both the defense doesn't know which one might be a receiver or a runner, or both might be receivers, and you can flex them both out and do some really interesting things.
21 Pony turns into 21 Speed, Jeff. You remember right. 21 Pony with Donnell Pumphrey and Darren Sproles. It was the rage of the offseason.
What do they call those little ponies at the fair? Like the really small ponies. That's kind of what that one was.
Yeah. Last one from me, Jeff, and make sure you read Jeff InsideTheBirds.com, the podcast with Adam Kaplan, one of the best in the business. Also, Adam, a friend of the show, Andrew DiCecco as well at InsideTheBirds.com. I do want to talk to you about Nick Sirianni, and this is more an opinion-based question. I want to get your opinion. Nick Sirianni, it's 350 today. He's banging the table. He wants this guy on the back end of his roster. Does Howie Roseman listen?
Who's the guy?
Well, it's a back end of the roster guy. So it's not, it's one of those things. How much power is he going to have? If he really, really bangs his table for a guy, and let's be honest, if you're talking about 52, 53 versus 54, you're not talking about a core player, a guy who's sitting in the preseason, a guy who's sitting there in dress clothes and doesn't have one preseason snap. But does he have that kind of power to sway Howie Roseman?
That's a good question. Look, I don't think Howie wants – I think Howie does want to have this be a smoother transition, and I do know that the Eagles are kind of sensitive about the opinions that have been out there, both on Howie and Jeffrey Lurie as an owner. I think if we were to put the scenario you're running me through the first test, right? You go back to the draft, round 3. Who won on Milton Williams? The coaches won, not the personnel staff, or certainly not Tom Donahoe. So they wound up going with Milton Williams. It seemed it seemed then, and it seems now like a victory for the coaches on that one. Other picks, you might wonder if that was more Howie Roseman influence or whether analytics went into it. So I will say it depends on the player, but I do think that Howie is not going to be an iron fist in year one with Nick Sirianni, the coaching staff. I think he's going to try to be flexible on who that player might be and what they can do.
I'm going to stay with a coaching question, but take it out of the decision-making process and get it back out onto the field. Nick Sirianni had a lot to say over this coaching staff, much more so than his predecessor, who actually was a Super Bowl winning coach. And they gave him a lot of latitude to bring in guys that he formerly coached with and knew and felt comfortable with. Are they where they're supposed to be going into week one? Always tough with transition. A lot of first-time coordinators, first time in Philadelphia. Do you think, being around this coaching staff whenever you've been in practice, Jeff, do you think they've accomplished what they wanted to, what they needed to, a little over a week before the first game?
It's a good question. Now, let me throw it back at you before I answer. When you say, are they where they are supposed to be, where are they supposed to be at this point? And I asked that, Jody, because
they go out and beat Atlanta week number 1. That's okay. A winnable game. Fine, they're going to be an underdog, but do they feel that they can go down and beat Atlanta week 1?
I think that they should. I think that the big thing – listen, they got a tough first 6 weeks. So I've been on record as saying I think that they're kind of a 7 to 9 win team at most. But they are strong where teams need to be strong to compete in the NFL, and that's in the trenches. And by week 1, as long as nothing happens between now and then, and 2 weeks of an eternity, if they got that healthy D-line, that healthy O-line, I believe they're in good shape to compete. Now, what happens? The only thing I wonder about is the second half of that game, because a lot of these guys didn't play a whole lot in the preseason. We know that. And the joint practices are very scripted. So as the game goes on and you're in move the ball situations for now, an hour or so, and even though you're rotating, are they ready for that second half? But you know what? You can ask the same questions to the Falcons because I think they only played starters for a little bit in that 4th preseason game too. So I would say they are where they are. But I also asked you that, Jody, because I know some people think the Eagles are going to win 10 or 11 games this year and be very competitive. And I think they'll be competitive, but I don't have those same visions as they do. So I understand that this is a flawed roster. So if they don't beat Atlanta, I'm not going to sit there and say, well, they're clearly not where I thought they were going to be. It's just they weren't better than Atlanta that day because they are still a work in progress. But as far as being healthy, you always want to get through this team especially. You want to get to the opener and be able to have most, if not all, of your starters healthy. They are definitely that for now. I mean, we'll see with Rodney McLeod and everything like that. But for the most part, they're healthy and ready to go.
And just generally speaking, because a lot of different things can happen in a game, but I think you get the point I'm trying to make. Better not go down to Atlanta, lose by 17 points. Well, that will be questioned here on Birds 365, on Inside the Birds, and everywhere else if they go down and get their tails kicked. Yeah, you're right.
I was looking at Atlanta's roster.
Guy makes a late field goal. They get beat 27-24. These things happen. They go down and they get beat 35-16. Oh, yeah, there's going to be answers to be had here as to how they went through their first camp.
Yeah, I was looking at Atlanta's roster again last night, and my God, they've got some talent on offense, but you can't find a single player on that defense other than Grady Jarrett, a really good defensive lineman, who's an accomplished pass rusher. In fact, you can't even find a guy who, other than maybe Dante Fowler, who had to take a pay cut, who you would say, I even recognize that guy as a pass rusher. So this should be for this Eagles offensive line, if they don't hold up well against the pass rush, and I know Dean Pease likes to do a whole lot of stuff on the back end, then that's a bad sign, because this Falcons, this game feels like it could be like 35-31 when all is said and done.
He is Geoff with a G, and he's proud of it, Mosher. And he has, once again, done a very good job with us here on Birds 365. Moshe, thanks, buddy. We'll certainly get you back up again soon enough.
All right, fellas. Have a great one.
Thanks, Moshe.
InsideTheBirds.com and Inside the Birds podcast with Adam Kaplan. Geoff Mosher here with us on Birds 365. All right, coming back, Johnny Mack got a couple more things to run by him. Bob Groats of the Delco Times going to be our guest in hour number 2. So keep it right here on Birds 365.
If you missed any of today's show on the JAKIB Media channel, listen to the podcast on your way home. Available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.